Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to our event, Healthcare in India, a Paradigm Shift. We are glad to begin our third and final session today, titled Pharmaceuticals in India. The speakers for the session include KG Ananthakrishnan, Director General, Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, OPPI; Varsha Rajesh, Member, Pharmaceutical Healthcare Medical Device and Digital Health Practice, Nishith Desai Associates; Tanya Kokade, Member, Pharmaceutical Healthcare Medical Device and Digital Health Practice, Nishith Desai Associates; Darren Punin, Leader, Pharma and Life Sciences Practice, Nishith Desai Associates; Ratandeep Roy Chaudhary, Leader, Private Equity and M&E Practice, Nishith Desai Associates. The session will be moderated by Dr. Milind Antani, Leader, Pharma and Life Sciences Practice and Social Sector Practice, Nishith Desai Associate. Thank you, speakers, for all your presence. We would like to thank our supporting partners, Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, Asia Pacific Medical Technology Association, Medical Technology Association of India, US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, TIE Silicon Valley, LSW Life Sciences World for supporting our event. For participants in the USA, if you wish to apply for a CLE or MCLE credit, please keep your eye on the chat box. I will be posting the details. I now hand over to Dr. Milind Antani to commence the session.
Thank you very much, Dipshi, and welcome you all on the last session of our event, Healthcare India Paradigm Shift. So last 2 days, we have discussed on medical device and digital health. And it was not intentional that I wanted to keep pharma last. But, pharmaceutical in India has suddenly become a buzzword. Many words like clinical trials, efficacy, safety, vaccines, affordability, risk taking have become household names. I'm so happy that we have KG. I call him KG, and the whole world calls him KG. So I'll call you KG only. Who has amazing experience of Indian pharma industry, global industry, and being leading the OPPI. We are going to have an excellent industry perspective. So what I was saying that because of possibly the pandemic, a lot of things people did not know about clinical trials, the launch of a product, import of a product, manufacturing of a product, investments into pharma industry. All those things people have started knowing. And that is what we thought. And all this thinking, though it was always a patient-centric, it has become very important. In fact, today afternoon only, Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi emphasized a lot on pharma sector and how important the pharma sector. Possibly it's a great thing, and I'm going to have KG develop on that also. So I'm so happy. So KG, I want to start with you. You have a wealth of experience of Indian pharma, and you have seen pharma from your MSD days to OPPI days, and being a very senior veteran champion. How do you feel the pharma has evolved over a period of years? How things have changed, and things are changing pretty fast. We discussed in our client education program also that pandemic also has created a lot of changes in the way companies function, in the way all the stakeholders function. I just want you to understand, to make us understand just about pharmaceutical industries in India. You're on mute, KG. You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
No. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Milind, for inviting me to this knowledge session. Appreciate and Nishith Desai Associates has been doing phenomenal work in the space of healthcare, pharmaceutical, medical technology, etc. And I appreciate always the extraordinary knowledge session that you bring to the table. Let me put it this way, that I think the pandemic has definitely brought the pharmaceutical industry to the limelight. And the industry responded to the pandemic with amazing speed and responsibility. See, if you look at the development that happened since the pandemic was declared last March, I think within a 12-month period, the industry delivered multiple vaccines. And not only vaccines, the industry developed other therapy, whether it is remdesivir or favipiravir, or so many multiple options came to address this healthcare challenge, which was never experienced in the world, at least in our lifetime. And the industry did an extraordinary job, and today when we talk about over 1.3 billion doses administered in India of vaccine, it's because of the pharma industry efforts and the research behind it. The fundamental stuff, and particularly the organization that I am representing, OPPI, we believe in research because that is what is going to lead us to address the healthcare challenges. So that's just to give you a perspective of what happened in the during the pandemic. But just as still the pandemic is continuing, but at least the intensity is a little bit under control. You have now multiple therapies coming in, whether it is Molnupiravir or the Pfizer product. So these will be therapies. So you will have a preventive, you will have a therapy, and I think we will address in a very comprehensive manner COVID challenges, plus the other coronavirus issues that could come up in the future, because this is not going to be the last of the pandemic. Hopefully, we will not have one immediately, but we must be prepared for some such thing to occur in the future and be prepared. So these drugs and vaccines that are being developed, I think, will have a long-term implication for even future therapies and vaccine development. That's the best part of what the pharmaceutical industry contributed. But you asked me a question which is not just only COVID alone, but the entire pharmaceutical industry. Let us look at the pharmaceutical industry's perspective has to be looked from a healthcare point of view, because the entire disease pattern is moving in a very particular manner. If you look at India, certainly from infectious diseases, for the last more than a decade, it has moved over to the non-communicable diseases, and that's what is occupying, whether it is diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, oncology, neurological diseases, which is really the ones which are making the major impact on the healthcare landscape. And you then mirror this with what the industry is doing. If you look at least the global pharma companies, much of the research is happening in addressing the challenge of cancers, so many different types of cancers. And clearly what's seen is that some of the cancers which we thought could not be addressed are today being addressed in a very emphatic manner, whether it is with a targeted therapy, whether it is with the biologics, whether it is gene therapy. There's significant progress, that has happened, and that's all thanks to the extraordinary research that's going on in the space of oncology. I'm just taking that as one example. And similarly, there are a lot of work going on in the space of diabetes. The type of drugs that we need to bring to address this, big issue that we have in India, because India is like a diabetes capital of the world, and we need to have appropriate medication. At the same time, there is also growing recognition that while for some time there was a very limited focus on infectious diseases, but today there is a growing realization that we are now facing a challenge of antimicrobial resistance. And hence we need to ensure that we have effective antibiotics to treat bugs which are getting resistant, right? And hence there are, certain focused work that is being done on antimicrobial resistance address. One is in the pattern of using the antimicrobial itself, because irresponsible usage of antibiotic results in the antimicrobial resistance. How can we try and make those type of behavioral modification, make it protocol based, therapy, so that the right antibiotic is being used for the right, infectious disease. What we call it as antimicrobial stewardship programs are being rolled out right across the globe, in addition to looking at effective therapies to address some of these, defined bugs. So there's a lot of research and work that is going on across the globe to ensure that these healthcare issues are addressed in a very comprehensive manner. And thanks to this research, I think we in India also get benefited out of it, because all this medication, we try to bring it to the benefit of the patients at the earliest. As soon as they are getting launched in the global market, we want to ensure that they are being made available to India. I will touch on the regulatory space a little bit, later. But what we must also uh, realize and understand is that today the treatment is going way beyond just only the pharmaceutical drugs.
Yes.
Right? It is going beyond. There is a lot of digital technologies that are coming in. Big data analytics is helping us to, do the treatments in a very effective manner, in a targeted fashion. So it is, and there are devices that are coming that complement and supplement a therapy to ensure that the outcome is finally much better than only a treatment with a pharmaceutical drug alone. Uh, there are a lot of complementary programs are being rolled out, like say in diabetes. We all know that just taking a drug is not going to help. You need to have a diet, you must have exercise, you must have healthy habits. And so it has become now a complete holistic package of managing a disease, rather than only just looking at the pharmaceutical agent. If you look at now cancer therapies, they are very highly targeted. If you find that there is a PDL1 sensitive one, then only the specific maps are being used to that particular type of cancer to get the best outcome. So today the therapy has become a lot more sophisticated, and that we need to really keep in mind. But if you look again, I'm moving a little bit on some of the big changes that have happened, Milind, in the last 1.5, 2 years. Is 2, 3 years back, had we talked about telemedicine, we would have said it's a good concept, but it is going to take a long time to develop in India. Today, it has become something like a mobile technology. We leapfrog from landlines to
True.
mobile technology. And today, telemedicine has become a part of life. Though there was a paper article saying that people are going back to the physical, meeting, which probably will happen because not everything can be addressed by telemedicine. But I think it's going to become a good hybrid, when the physician feels that he needs to have the patient in person and wants to check him, advise him, he will do that. And then the follow-up therapy probably is going to do it on a telemedicine. So it's going to become a good hybrid model, which is what we wanted for the use of technology. But the pandemic has made us drive. And that also helped in the development of the telemedicine, medicine regulations, etc. That is something more. The biggest beneficiary of this is going to be the penetration of this to tier 3, tier 2, areas where the medical infrastructure itself is very, limited. So use of technology can really help penetrate the treatments to the tier 2, tier 3 cities. That is one. And I'll take just 1 or 2 more minutes and then hand it over.
No, sure, please go ahead.
The other one is the e-pharmacy. Yes, there is. E-pharmacy was evolving, and it did evolve. but it accelerated dramatically in the last 1.5 years. I think almost everybody has moved to, a significant, I wouldn't say almost everybody, a good chunk has moved to, e-pharmacy because people want to be safe. It's being delivered at home. So these type of shifts and use of technology, we must embrace it. All right, technology being used for lab studies today. How many times do you really go to a lab to get study? The lab comes to your doorstep to
Yes.
get everything done. So these are the type of technological changes that were already evolving. And as I said in one of your meetings earlier, we must take pandemic as an opportunity. And some of
Absolutely.
these technologies really, helped us to leapfrog and move much more faster. So that's benefiting the patient. Few areas where, today you did refer about, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's session today in the IPA conclave on innovation. I think it was music to ears. And in fact, I was attending to most of the sessions. See, India has to move because India is a powerhouse of generic medicine. There are no
True.
doubts about it. We are known as pharmacy of the world. But if you look at the way the whole medicine and therapies are evolving, we cannot remain as pharmacy of the world unless you become innovator, of the world.
Yes.
And hence the new slogan that he coined, from Make in India to Discover in India is an extraordinary shift. And I'm sure if we continue to focus on innovation and bring that adequate ecosystem to facilitate innovation, India in the next 10, 15 years, or it may take 20 years, it may take time. We did not become overnight pharmacy of the world. It's from 75. I have been watching this industry, and today we are taking a great pride in it. But, in the next 20 years, I'm sure we will have some proud moment because innovations will start to happen. And we are already seeing some glimpses of it, whether it is a COVID vaccine coming out from, Bharat Biotech or from Zydus Cadila, and an mRNA vaccine in development by Genova. So Indian pharma industry is certainly moving in that direction, and we must encourage it. So we have to create that innovation ecosystem where regulatory landscape is going to play a very, very important role, and it needs to get streamlined a lot. I'm also happy that probably during the course of the conversation, it may come up in the discussion and we can go through it a little bit more in detail. But the interesting part is that there is also a separate committee that has been established to really go through the Drugs and Cosmetics Act in its entirety and see how best it can get globally aligned, how we
Yes.
can decriminalize, how we can fast track some of these, approval process so that it at the end of the day benefits the patient. It encourages clinical research in this particular country. It encourages faster introduction of products from the global, stable so that the patients get the benefit. These big changes, which are being now contemplated, should make a significant impact as we go forward. In fact, I will conclude with this, you know, uh, Milind, is that there was this E&Y report, and I'm sure you've all seen that, where there is a very interesting projection that India from $4 billion in 2000 is now $42 billion. In fact,
Yes.
5.2 billion to 42 billion in 2020. Right now, this $42 billion has a potential to become $130 billion by
Yes.
2030, which is significant. You're talking about three times,
Exponential.
exponential growth. It is feasible because if you look at it, it is not just a number sitting there, but there are building blocks that are there. And if you look at the building blocks, something very interesting is that the biologics and vaccines is going to be quite a significant part of it. If you look at it, biosimilars domestic market itself is expected to be about $10 billion. And on top of it, another $9 to $10 billion is an export opportunity. So we are talking about a 20 billion on biosimilar,
Agreed.
on biologics. Vaccines, we are looking at only adult vaccines, because till COVID vaccines came, the concept of adult vaccination was not there. We were
Not
only
there.
vaccination
Agreed.
was only pediatrics. We never knew, despite the fact there were wonderful adult vaccination to prevent yourselves from flu or from cervical cancer, but we never thought that vaccines are required for adults. But now COVID vaccine has changed that paradigm, saying that what, you have to take care of your health as adults as well, and we are expecting that this will bring in a lift up to the adult vaccination that is expected to be another $6 to $7 billion. And just taking a few numbers, so these are the type of growths that are going to be there, and the industry grows at about 12%. We will hit $130 billion, and that is not a small number.
Huge number. It's a
It's a
huge number.
opportunity that is there for the industry. Yeah,
I think, yeah, excellent KG. I think as expected. Few important points you touched upon is a shift from Make in India to Discover India in India, and we will touch upon that. But what I think comes, being a doctor also says that it is always believed that prevention is better than cure. And so far, the sector has been more therapeutic and less prophylactic. But now, because of the COVID and biologics and vaccines you just mentioned, significant focus is shifting on prophylactic also. And that is where I think we are seeing the huge shift happening. And as you very rightly mentioned, the regulatory landscape is going to play a huge role. And being at the position you are in OPPI and the movement OPPI is doing on certain regulatory policies is praiseworthy. We'll discuss that. But before that, I want Darren, my colleague, to just talk about how the regulations has evolved to commensurate with what KG just mentioned. Darren?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Antani. So I think in contrast to what I maybe have said for medical device and digital health, I'm actually a little more positive in my outlook for pharmaceutical industry. A lot more, in fact, because I think we've come to a stage where even though we are not there in terms of perfection, we are very stable. Today, the industry at least is very well aware that this is how things are and this is how things function. And especially in the past 2 years at least, we've seen such collaboration with the regulator, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, where whatever has been required in order to treat or fast track any requirement for the pandemic, be it from the vaccine point of view or from antiviral point of view, we've seen such a positive outlook from the regulator side. And in fact, because we've also been helping our clients with some of these requirements, we've seen the red carpet rolled out for so many different requirements, etc. The fact is that today we know that the regulators on our side, and they're going to be helping a lot, and we're seeing that develop as well. So while there are certain issues, and I think KG has also identified some of them. I think if I had to talk about some of the lingering aspects that we still need to take care of, one of course is the streamlining of timelines for approvals. See, we know for a fact that it is possible for the regulator to move very, very quickly. So how do we convert that acceleration that we saw for the pandemic into something that's a little more concrete for regular pharmaceutical products as well? Because today, to give you an example, an import license for a particular product can take up to 9 months, right? And 9 months is not a very small timeline in the whole regulatory process to be able to bring a drug into India. And at the same time, when we look at pricing is also still a very, very big pain point for for many companies, primarily because I think it's about time that we maybe re-looked at the way in which you calculate or on what basis you calculate the entire price capping, on how much of the industry is really price capping required, for example. And these are some questions that are coming up now to try and deal with. And luckily, we are also seeing that the government is actively also partaking in trying to figure out how better we can, make these regulations work for the industry. And it seems like, we're open to discussion. The conversations are free flowing. And we do see that this is a focus as well. The other aspect, of course, is on innovation. As KG also mentioned, now today, there is a push for innovation within India, and I think it's about time that our regulations also started moving from looking at the Indian pharmaceutical market as that generic setup to trying to fuel the innovation within the country. And we are seeing again that the government is moving towards that angle as well. We're seeing an R&D policy being developed for pharmaceuticals specifically. So we're going to be seeing definite changes. Right now, because of the fact that we are splitting regulatory and IP separately, and one ministry not talking with the other ministry with respect to how to protect these assets together, there are some teething issues that we may need to look at how we can harmonize and see how we can get to the place that we would like to be, so that innovation is something that we can move forward from. And I think, some of these issues, if we take care of, the other thing that we're seeing, and especially because of the pandemic, we have as a country been very, very heavily dependent on API import. And now, of course, we're looking to move away from that. And again, the government has put out, production linked incentive schemes to try and bring API manufacturing into the country, because that's again something that's required to be able to completely be in control of the supply channel. So if some of these areas are maybe ironed out, I think we can move from where we are today, which I would refer to as stable, to something that can be actually very prolific. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to you.
I think there are very, very important points you touched upon, and whether it is pricing, whether it is API, bulk drug issues, we are going to touch upon regulations specifically. And we are going to touch upon, because pharmaceutical industry is a very interesting industry. Lots of types of business models are there. But before we move on to that specific regulations, Ratnadeep, I want to come to you. You have a significant experience in investment deals, seasoned player. And we also picked up from what KG mentioned that, of course, COVID brought us a lot of opportunities. And he very rightly mentioned in one of our earlier programs that crisis always brings opportunities. And if you see Pfizer, BioNTech, Astra with Oxford, you are seeing lots of these type of models, and small companies are becoming innovative companies, and they are sitting on something big. At the same time, clinical trial has become very important. So CROs play a huge role. Research, as KG mentioned, is becoming very important. And of course, the hardcore manufacturing and supply. So I personally have felt that pharmaceutical sector has always been a favorite of investors. I'm not going into mergers, acquisitions, and business deals. I'm more on the investment climate. And considering your experience, do you agree that yes, investors are always looking for investing, I would say, more biased, but pharma sector has always been a favorite for them? And because of that, I think I also want you to tell us what are the points companies should keep in mind to become investor friendly and 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 uh, and be ready for investments. We'll go to the specific laws later. Yeah, Ratnadeep. You're on mute.
Audible now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Antani, for inviting and introducing that topic. I think, of course, the allocation of capital becomes an important piece in the overall development of any industry, and something as critical as pharmaceuticals and healthcare in general. Uh, for that, of course, the proper allocation of capital is something that is beneficial to everybody. So, as you rightly pointed out, Doctor, the pharma sector within the broader healthcare sector has always been a favorite, and that has been the case for, I've been looking at deals for about 14, 15 years now, and I have seen that a large allocation towards this sector throughout this decade and a half that I have been active. And there are two main reasons for it. One is that this is an industry where it has two very interesting features which always attract different kinds of investors. One is there is always a demand, so there is stability for it. It is one of the fundamental functions, fundamental cogs of overall society and economy. So that stability of demand and the stability of revenue is something that is very attractive to investors, and therefore that is something that results in capital allocation. And the second aspect about pharma again is that there is constant innovation. So there is a constant ability to find the new leader in the industry, whether it's because of some kind of experimental therapy, or it is because of a more efficient manufacturing process, or as you all will know, for discovery of different chemical compounds, which you can really leapfrog a company into a really profitable growth. So these are the various reasons because of which I have obviously seen that pharmaceuticals and healthcare generally has always been a favorite with investors. Now, increasingly today, there is another additional reason why it is a favored industry, which is the metric on ESG. As we see, when you see global capital allocation, whether it is from sovereign wealth funds, whether it's from family offices, into various fund managers, a very important metric for them to meet is in terms of the environmental, social, and governance parameters in terms of the target entity. So the pharma industry, in many cases, and healthcare generally, will naturally score highly on that particular metric. So that is another reason that is sort of driving capital allocation towards this industry. And the third reason is obviously the most proximate one. As a result of this pandemic, quite naturally, nobody can look away from the importance of this particular industry, and recency bias is there. So naturally, there is an increased, I would say, flow of capital that we are seeing towards this industry. So these are the main reasons why I would agree with you that the industry remains a popular and one of the preferred sectors into which capital is allocated. Then your next part of the topic was in terms of what can companies which wish to attract this kind of capital and utilize it efficiently, what can they do to attract it and to keep themselves ready for such investments. Now, companies in India, as with all other companies, I think one of the key things that attracts capital into India, and especially in the pharma sector, and as Darren also sort of touched upon it, is the stability of our legal regime and the predictability and the similarity with, I would say, common law jurisdictions across the world. So that similarity gives us a natural advantage where a lot of our laws are sort of either derived from or are similar to other common law jurisdictions. So it is more familiar for foreign capital to understand what our legal regime is. And, and of course, the stability factor. Now, of course, no, this experience of with the legal sector, with the regulatory sector in India is not 100% smooth. But here we are always talking about relative experiences. And from my whatever interactions I've had, the general perception is of a country which is stable, which is predictable, and which is bankable. So these are key features that are helping our country. And similarly, for companies which are looking to attract uh, capital, these are levers which they can rely on to make sure that they are the preferred destination. So when I say that, what do I mean? I mean that they should, within the legal framework that is there within our country, for whichever is their product, make sure that they have the best demonstrable protections. So whether it be by way of patents, whether it be by way of licenses, if it is in terms of manufacturing, whatever other regulations and things are applicable, to be always up to date on those. Of course, a big part of this is inspections by the FDA and other foreign authorities as well, to which countries our manufactured products are often exported. So these are often absolutely critical gating items for investment to happen into those countries. So that's of course sector specific, but more generally speaking, of course, we have a foreign exchange regime, which while facilitative is not 100% capital account convertible. So in that respect, there are certain limitations in terms of sources of capital in terms of what instruments can be given, and in terms of what rights and other contractual provisions can be negotiated. So it would always be beneficial to have knowledge or working knowledge, or otherwise have advisors who can guide the company through the basics of what investors would typically look for, and to try and structure our capital table, try and structure our shareholding structure in a way that is in a position which can welcome capital. So these are typically, I would say, preparatory steps that can be taken by companies to try and attract capital.
Thank you. I think it was a very complicated topic you simplified in a very easy and best possible way. And I totally agree that yes, pharma is sector and company needs to be aware of what all you just mentioned. And there is we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of models are there. The pharma sector, we're talking about accessibility, manufacturing, collaborations, distributions. So, Varsha, I want to come to you. There are various business models are there, and we are talking about paradigm shift, and things are changing. What we have seen that broad business models which are changing, existing also. So, can you tell us how exactly the broadly the business models which are prevalent in Indian pharma industry, and what are the laws? Of course, Darren touched upon how it has evolved, but I also want you to tell us about what are the specific laws which are applicable to every stakeholders in these business models. Varsha?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Antani. So, the way I'd like to address this question is first talk about the general prevailing pharmaceutical business setups that we see today in India, and then proceed to the stakeholders in this entire ecosystem, and lastly discuss the law in brief. So, proceeding to the first bit on with respect to the business models we see, primarily in the first year, when we speak about manufacturing, there are two categories and essentially two business models. So the first business model is one where we see that the manufacture is happening independently and the pharmaceutical companies command their own independent infrastructure and have their own processing channels. And the second category of pharma manufacturing model that we see is something that we call contract manufacturing. So this essentially means that the manufacturing processes itself are outsourced on a contract basis, and there are contract agreements that are placed between the contract manufacturer as well as the main business, which is outsourcing the particular manufacturing uh, uh, operations. And even in contract manufacturing arrangements, we see two forms. The first being a business to business model, in which the entire manufacturing process itself is outsourced. And the second being something that we call as door licensing model. So in this particular contract, what we see is that the contract manufacturer only undertakes certain production activities and not the entire production itself. Proceeding to the second tier in the pharmacy landscape, we have businesses which make products available to the consumers. So for this, the distributing channels that we have in general are pharmacies and institutional healthcare providers such as hospitals, who are the ones who are making the drugs available to the end user. But a new model that is emerging here is e-pharmacies. So essentially, e-pharmacies is where we have a technology platform whereby which normal physical pharmacies are selling drugs through the technology platform, or the technology platform operates an inventory of its own and it's able to dispense drugs on independently. So proceeding to the second part of the question as to who the stakeholders in this entire ecosystem is. First, we have the manufacturer, who is either the pharma company itself or the contract manufacturer. Then in the second tier, we have pharmacies and businesses who are responsible for making the drugs available to the end user. So generally, these are pharmacies or hospitals, or now we see e-pharmacies also operating in this tier. And lastly, we also have the consumer. The consumer is basically the end user of the pharmaceutical product. And related to all of these, someone who ties in all of these is the regulator. So a regulator is essentially the regulatory body which is authorized to regulate the entire pharmaceutical sector and look after the application of laws. So proceeding to the last bit on the legislations which are applicable, the primary legislation which governs pharmaceuticals in India is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And the Drugs and Cosmetics Act is supplemented by the Drugs and Cosmetic Rules. So broadly, this framework regulates the import, manufacture, as well as the sale of drugs in India. And specifically, the manufacturers, importers, and sellers of drugs in India have to obtain a license from the drug authorities under this particular framework. So there are several classes of licenses which are actually issued depending upon the type of the drug itself. So these licenses essentially dictate the conditions of the manufacturing facility, the precautionary measures which have to be undertaken by the party, as well as certain employment requirements. So it's also important to note that the license issued under the Drugs and Cosmetics framework is to a particular manufacturing facility and not to the entity which is manufacturing itself. So essentially, this means that if a license is issued for perhaps like manufacture of like a vaccine to a company which is located in Bangalore, then the particular vaccine will have to be manufactured only in the licensed facility, and it cannot be manufactured or stored in a different facility owned or operated by the same company. So the implication of this is that when we have a contract manufacturing model, the contract manufacturer is the one who holds the license for the facility and not the hiring pharmaceutical company itself. So this is something that has to always be kept in mind when it comes to pharma businesses, is that the license is not associated with the entity, but it is associated with the facility itself. So there are also licenses which apply for import of drugs according to the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And in addition to compliance with the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, the importers will also have to comply with certain other laws, specifically the Foreign Trade and Development Regulation Act, as well as the import and export policies, which are revised from time to time in India. And another additional consideration which importers will have to take care of is that if the drug is not manufactured in domestic facilities, it does not mean that the standards of manufacturing which is laid down under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act will not be applicable. Instead, all of the manufacturing practices, we have something called as the good manufacturing practices which have been issued under this framework, will have to be complied with by the facility which is manufacturing in the location outside of India. So essentially, indirectly, all of the compliances required to be followed by manufacturers will also have to be complied with for drugs which are imported into India in order to get a license of import. So in addition to the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, we also have certain other ancillary regulations, which I will not be dealing with in detail because we will be addressing each of these in detail through this evening. But however, just to be aware of what the framework is, we have something called as the clinical trial rules. So the clinical trial rules actually govern the process of receiving a marketing approval in India and also provide for the standards of safety and efficacy of a drug which is sought to be sold in India. And in addition to this, the advertising of drugs and pharmaceutical products is regulated under the Drugs and Magic Remedies Objectionable Advertisements Act. And in addition to this, we also have a pricing regulation, which is called as the Drug Price Control Order, through which there are certain price capping mechanisms which are imposed on all pharmaceutical products in India. And lastly, with respect to retail, we have something called as the Pharmacy Act, which is applicable to channels of dispensation of drugs in India, specifically to all pharmacies and pharmacists. Over to you, Dr. Antani.
Yeah, thank you, Varsha. I think that was very important basic information which possibly sometimes we feel, hey, we know all, but sometimes we don't know. But you touched upon one of the important models, and one of them is, I think, a product being accessible to the patient in India. KG also in his opening remark talked about the patient centricity, which is key to entire pharma and healthcare. So Tanya, I want to come to you now. Let's talk about accessibility, and KG also mentioned about new drugs coming, and so many new drugs are coming now. So can you talk about how a product can be launched in India, whether it is Indian domestic product or a global product coming to India? And have you seen things have changed in the product launch? And what are the issues there, Tanya?
Sure, Doc, definitely. These are very important points that were pointed out by Mr. KG and Varsha about how accessibility has become a key component in swaying demand in the pharmaceutical market in our country. And there has been a continuous evolution in terms of the increase in research and development in the sector, or rather manufacturing of drugs domestically, which is gaining momentum since the past few years. So even though we might say that India is still not an innovator's market, but it is definitely on its way to becoming one. So let me take you through the process of how a pharmaceutical product may be launched in India. This is from the grassroots level, where it begins with the initial discovery of the drug itself for treating any condition. So this drug is discovered by basic scientific research first, and then there is preclinical research, which is undertaken to study the drug, to study its safety, toxicity, or to determine the dosage and efficacy of the drug in the country. So the data that is collected from this preclinical research that is conducted for a particular drug, it is submitted to the regulatory authorities who provide approvals to conduct trials in humans to study the drug and its impact on human population in the country. So in the pre-initiation stage, the sponsor for any of these clinical trials which are undertaken to determine the safety and efficacy of the drug, they have to obtain an import or manufacturing license for the drug that they wish to study. And then they have to register the clinical trial with the regulatory authority and the ethics committee, so all of these requirements have been clearly laid down under the clinical trial rules, as talked about by Varsha in her discussion. And upon receiving an approval from the authority, the sponsor may commence trials with respect to the study drug. So to give you a brief on how these clinical trials are undertaken in India, it's in 4 phases, and each phase requires an approval before moving on to the next phase of the clinical trial. So the first phase tests the safety and dosage of the drug, and subsequently its therapeutic efficacy, that is to determine the side effects, or to concretize the dosage pattern of the drug. All of that is taken up in the next phase, that is the phase 2 of the trial. Subsequently, phase 3, which is more like a large scale version of the second phase of the trial, here the adverse reactions, or how the drug acts on the larger human population, is observed and noted to determine what the therapeutic benefits of the drug would be. Now, when the sponsor of the clinical trial completes all of these phases of the study and provides the safety and efficacy data of the drug, he may be provided with a marketing approval for the drug in the country. And upon gaining this approval, the drugs are packed, labeled in accordance with the applicable rules, that will be the drugs and cosmetic rules and the legal metrology packaged commodity rules, which are applicable in India for sale in the country. And the final phase, like I said, there would be 4 phases. The final phase, which is phase 4 of these clinical trials, is taken up post-marketing. So these are studies which are conducted for every approved drug in the country, and they take cognizance of any rare adverse effect that the drug might have upon its application on a large population. So this becomes a necessity in order to determine any side effects that might have been missed out during all the study phases that are taken up for a drug in the country. And to address the second part of the question posed by you, Dr. Antani, I would say that the past 2 years saw the introduction and implementation of the clinical trial rules. So these rules effectively replace Schedule Y of the drugs and cosmetics rules, which were introduced earlier to regulate clinical trials in India and to support the generic product manufacturing industry that India housed in the earlier times. And where we see innovation, there was a deficiency that was observed in these rules in terms of the ethical review procedures, or the lack of a compensation mechanism with respect to human participants who were part of those clinical trial studies. And there was very minimal protection, I would say, which was granted to these clinical trial participants earlier. So the new CT rules that were introduced 2 years ago in 2019, they replaced and consolidated the clinical trial framework. So they now provide for procedures, approvals, and even like even a proper mechanism and formula for determining compensation in case of any clinical trial related injuries. So the CT rules have honestly replaced what made up multiple stop gaps in the previous legislation, that is the Schedule Y, and the notification is meant to provide a comprehensive set of rules to regulate these new drugs which are manufactured in India or which may be brought from outside or imported into India, and to provide for like a greater clarity and synchronization in the regulatory framework. So I think that has been the development in the past 2 years, and it obviously encourages the whole ecosystem surrounding new drug manufacturing in India, Doc.
Thank you, Tanya. I think one important word or important element that came out in your discussion was new drug. That's very important. And that's where I'll go back to what KG mentioned about the need for shifting from make to discover. So KG, I just want to understand and I want you to elaborate more on what you just talked about from make in India to discover in India and how exactly we can move. So where are we? Prime Minister said that yes, this is required, but ultimately, you rightly mentioned that there is a role of regulator and government to play. There is a need for a political will is fine, but at the end of the day, industry is going to play a huge role. So I just want you to elaborate more on making India to discover in India. And that is where things are going to change.
Sure. Dr. Anthony, before I go there, I will set the context of the regulation because
Sure.
it's got a huge implication on Discover in India as well. You know, while we are happy that there are some committees that have been set up for streamlining, we have to wait and see how that is going to finally come out because they are still work in progress. But if you currently look at our regulation, there are a lot of gaps that are there in the regulation which needs to be, fixed. One single example that I will take is the Rule 101. See, in the new drug rules that came in, clinical trials rule that came in, we had the Rule 101 and the list of countries that have to be listed that is languishing for the last 2 years. With the result, the benefit of accelerating the global introductions into the country based on its safety efficacy being very well demonstrated across the population through MRCT studies, that is still not getting passed on to India. And we have been advocating that you need to provide the list of the countries so that once that is done, the ambiguity of getting exemption from phase 3 clinical trials is completely overcome. Unfortunately, that has not come as of now, and still one is advocating for it. So similarly, we are looking at biosimilar guidelines. Okay, there is another committee that has been formulated by the Department of Biotechnology to review the biosimilar guidelines. The earlier biosimilar guidelines were pretty globally aligned, then it got diluted. And our, position has been that while we need to encourage, biosimilar research in this country, but it is very important that there is no compromise on the safety efficacy because biologics are a very different kind of products. They are not like a chemical, chemistry-based entity. So we need to have very strong, robust, biosimilar guidelines so that the safety efficacy is not compromised at all. So there are areas where still we need to really fix a lot of issues. Similarly, Darren did touch upon it on pricing, right? We have been always saying that, listen, it's interesting that you have now market-based pricing mechanism, but with the introduction of trade margin rationalization, you are having a backdoor methodology of even controlling the schedule formulation. That's not a fair process, because very clearly the idea was that products that are there in the schedule, yes, they need to get controlled because that has the maximum impact on the maximum number of patient population. The rest of it will be determined by market-based pricing, which is for the non-scheduled formulation. But now with TMR on the 42 products that was put on a pilot phase, practically you have imposed a price control mechanism for even the non-scheduled formulation. These type of ambiguities should be avoided. Similarly, for patented product pricing, while there is para 32, but still there is always a pressure, that patented products also will be brought under pricing control. And the fact that now with the, there's a potential possibility that a couple of patented products may be there in the new NLEM. And if there is in the NLEM, de facto, they are getting under price control. So on the one hand, we want to improve in terms of ease of doing business. On the other hand, there are several loopholes, that are there, which needs a lot of tightening. And we hope and expect that in all these regulatory refinements that are going to happen, some of these issues will get addressed, including in the area of patent, because patent infringement has become a norm. They get infringed left, right, and center. We need a much more robust mechanism so that patents are protected. Now I link it up to Discover in India. The reason why I wanted to frame this is all these rules, regulation, acts, they have got a bearing. If India has to move from Make in India to Discover in India, there are 3-4 buckets that we need to really identify and set right. First and foremost is the regulatory bucket. And that is the reason why the government has taken up the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. In fact, there was already a committee that was there. And incidentally, I was part of that. And the deliberation went on for a very long time. It's the recommendation of those committee that is now getting translated into the form of the R&D policy document. Right. And if you look at that R&D policy document, one of the first recommendation is we need to streamline the entire regulatory environment. Okay. And there must be coordinated approach. There is a DBT, there is a CDSCO, there is a state regulator, there is a, forest and environment ministry requirement. So there are multiple agencies that are governing in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, and hence the delays and things do not move the way that it wants to be moved. So one of the fundamental recommendations is that please streamline the regulatory landscape and hopefully something interesting will happen. That is number one. The second part is the question of having adequate industry academia collaboration. See, today there is a lot of value that can be derived by adequate industry academia collaboration. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen much. They all work in silos because there is no incentive for even the academia to collaborate, right? And our focus has been more on publishing papers rather than patenting and creating value out of it. So unless we move towards this direction, the innovation will not spark. So one of the recommendation actually in the R&D policy is the BIDOL type of an act that must come in over here, so that the researchers and academic can in fact become entrepreneurs and monetize their inventions or innovations. So these type of mechanisms has to be brought in to have industry academia collaboration. The third one is developing infrastructure. We do not have the infrastructure. And in fact, in the conclave that was happening, some very interesting thoughts. If you look at the Boston, Massachusetts area or the Singapore Biopolis, these are all some classical examples, how by establishing phenomenal infrastructure, it has attracted capital and it has become absolute vibrant, innovative innovation centers, and most of the products are coming from there. We need to get that particular type of an infrastructure in this country and also attract capital, for innovation. Because right now, innovation capital is very, very minuscule, right? Capital, what we are talking about, private equity and others are going into more of deals of mergers, acquisitions, etc., rather than on specific innovation-centric type of investment. That's very, very small. but that will come, flowing in, provided the entire ecosystem recognizes, incentivizes, and rewards innovation. If that happens, you will find a lot of money also flowing in. So R&D policy is hopefully going to have a good direction going forward. The Drugs and Cosmetics Act will hopefully streamline many of the gaps that are there. We also are pushing that the Patents Act needs to also get strengthened. Such type of infringements must not be allowed because it's going to come to bite us. It's only a question of time, right? Then there is no purpose in innovation. You innovate, you register within 4 years, somebody else goes through the back door and dumps the product into the market. That has, no meaning. Sequential pre and post grant opposition. That this is the only country, and you frustrate the whole process of patenting, taking 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. That's not the way that India must really facilitate patenting regime in this country. So we have been advocating that bring in a much more robust, IP regime in the country, so that it will incentivize again, research to come in. And also, Milind, if you look at the global pharma companies, $180 billion is the annual outlay for R&D. That's not a small money. $180 billion, right? We have not been able to attract that, neither that money nor the technology, nor that research into this particular country. Countries like China have gone about and done it, right? So South Korea has done it. India must also work. And how will it happen? See, it's not only the money coming in. The most important, if you create the right ecosystem, if the global research comes to India, along with money, lot of technology, knowledge, process, all that also comes to the country, which is going to be of great value to us, right? That's the way that innovation must get, encouraged, not only for the domestic industry, but for the entire pharmaceutical industry. India must become something like a innovation base. Yes. And that is what will truly move us from just make in India, which made us the pharmacy to the world, to become a discover in India, so that we retain and become a sustainable pharmacy to the world. Otherwise, this pharmacy to the world could be a short-term type of a thing, because with the type of developments that are happening in the biopharmaceutical research, you need to put that money for getting the new products, and hopefully we will be there. I'm an optimist, and hopefully we will be there.
And a very important point, and you touched upon a very important aspect for Indian pharma, is sustainability. And it is said that innovate or evaporate, and to prevent that evaporation, a conducive environment. That is what I think the need. And fortunately, I think the government is moving towards that direction, but has to move fast. And you also talked about an interesting thing. There's a significant money reserved for innovations, research, etc. But somehow it is not coming to India. And that's why the clinical used to be a hub, and it nosedived because of multiple reasons, and slowly limping back to some extent. And we have touched upon this. So Darren, I just want to quickly come to you. Tanya talked about clinical trial tools. Varsha talked about, KG also mentioned about research and development. So India was somewhere, then became nowhere, and trying to be somewhere. Can you just quickly, like KG mentioned about Rule 101, which is the absolutely boilerplate thing according to me. Can you just talk about hits and misses on research, maybe clinical research, quickly?
Sure. Thanks, Doc. So yeah, the framework for a good clinical trial regulation has been set in place with the introduction of the new drug and clinical trial rules of 2019. And ideally, what this did was it took everything that was done positively for the past 4 to 5 years, put it all into one place so that it could streamline the entire process well. And then it added certain additional security measures which were missing earlier. For example, a little more control over BA/BE studies, bioavailability, bioequivalence studies, registration requirements, and it put it all into one nice bouquet, and it said, okay, so here are the new rules for you. And then it had flavors of what it could also be. And this is where the local clinical trial waivers came in, expedited trials, all of these provisions for what could take the clinical trial ecosystem further. It was set up within the framework, but it was never exercised. And I think KG hit the nail on the head when it came to Rule 101, because if you don't identify the countries on whose support you can, rely on with respect to the kind of studies that have been conducted in those countries, how are you going to look into local clinical trial waivers? Where are you going to look into expedited trials? And we've seen this play out in the past year, year and a half, because we've been working with clients who are working towards COVID-19 vaccines and non-COVID-19 vaccines, right? And in that scenario, we've seen one, if the existing clinical trial framework was sufficient, there would not have been an entirely different set of guidelines and rules set up specifically to fast track the approval process for COVID-19 vaccines. The government had to redraft or go back to scratch when it came to how the whole emergency use authorization, which is not a concept actually recognized within the existing framework, had to be done for the purposes of COVID-19 vaccine. Great that they did, and it worked out very well because a lot of things moved very quickly. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't available within the existing framework. So when we saw regular non-COVID-19 trials going through the same process in the same time, it took much, much longer. We're still at what? Subject expert committee meetings, even though we would have started a year and a half ago. And these things, they're still taking time. And I think that's where we are facing the biggest miss with respect to the current clinical trial regulation. The fact is, while the structure has been put out, I think it's time that we actually start making sure that whatever provisions have been put in to try and get the framework to a place where we can actually start relying on international studies, where we can start expediting for the purposes of trying to get products into the market quicker and to try and reduce the regulatory timelines overall. I think that's where we can go from where we are today, which is also a good place to be considering where we used to be back in 2013, which was at a complete suspension of clinical trials, and we can move forward from there. So I think that's what I talk about.
Yeah, that's very important. And let me continue the same discussion with Tanya. Tanya, you talked about the product launch and how the laws and clinical trials enter. But I just want you to very briefly and quickly elaborate. There is how the international players, KG also touched upon that. Yes, clinical trial is one. Darren also talked about hits and misses there. But what are the challenges that has evolved, for international players to launch their products in India? Can you tell us very briefly?
Sure, Doc, definitely. So rightly said, Darren and Mr. KG pointed out that there has been an increasing influx of international players who seek to enter into Indian markets, pharmaceutical markets, because the opportunities are so exciting and the potential is tremendous. So Varsha has already laid down the base for how this may be undertaken through the import channel, where they register their drugs and they gain permissions in terms of the import licenses, and then the drug is brought into our country. So I will be talking about this from a more risks and challenges perspective to answer your question specifically, Dr. Antani. So the risk involved in acting. So when a foreign manufacturer seeks to enter into our country, they can either do this through an Indian authorized agent who is the importer in our country, or a contract research organization. So these two bodies, either of these two bodies, they act as a representative for the purpose of holding regulatory approvals, and also carrying out the sponsor responsibilities which are required under our regulatory framework. So the risk involved in acting through an Indian authorized agent or a CRO is that all regulatory approvals and permits which are received under the CT rules, they are assigned to these entities and not to the foreign company. So if a foreign company intends to, for any reason whatsoever in the future, to terminate these contractual arrangements with these entities, there is no provision which talks about transferring the regulatory approvals which have already been obtained to these foreign entities under the CT rules. So, as a risk mitigation measure, the foreign company can obtain a representation from these bodies, either the Indian authorized agent or the CRO, stating that in an event that in the future a contract is terminated or revoked for any reason, they must provide assistance in the transitory period, and the approvals that have been obtained by them may be surrendered. So, it must also be kept in mind that many trials in India are conducted by government affiliated sites or government owned sites, and care has to be taken by these foreign manufacturers while interacting with these officials, because the whole legal framework surrounding bribery and corruption in India is very robust, and they would become liable to be answerable in terms of these government side public servants under the Prevention of Corruption Act in India. In terms of challenges that are faced by these foreign manufacturers, there would also be that any foreign new chemical entity, it may require trial data approval from a foreign jurisdiction before it is brought into India for initiation of trials, because the first human trials, the first in-man studies that are to be undertaken for a foreign approved drug, they are not permitted in India in the first phase of the clinical trial. So any changes in composition or strengths or dosage forms that the manufacturer might seek to include in terms of the drugs might require restarting the whole procedure. So that would indefinitely increase the time period there is for getting, pre-initiation and post-initiation approvals. And I would say that Varsha had pointed this out, that while Indian clinical trial standards have been sought to be modeled on international standards such as the WHO GCP, that is the Good Clinical Practices, and the US FDA GCP, India itself has separate specific standards, including its own GCP guidelines. And conformity with just the international standards does not suffice, but there must be compliance with the Indian regulations as well. So these would be some of the challenges that the foreign manufacturer will have to determine and strategize before it actually undertakes, entering into the Indian markets. Dr. Ndani. Doc, you're on mute.
Right. So I think that's a very important point, and let me touch upon another important aspect of accessibility before I move to Ratnadeep on finance side for the accessibility. So Varsha, important part is the retail and consumer activities when it comes to providing access. And there are some interesting developments that have happened over retail and consumer activities and some challenges. Can you just share that?
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Antani. When we speak about the regulatory developments in terms of the retail and consumer activities in the recent past, we're mostly talking about the Consumer Protection Act. So, as we know, the Consumer Protection Act has been revised only 2 years ago in 2019, and there is a much more robust mechanism which has been introduced in place. So, to give you a gist of the Consumer Protection Act itself, broadly it protects the right of consumers, and there is a three-tier system for escalation of complaints and redressal mechanism in India. So the reason why this legislation becomes so important is because it lays down the foundation for product liability regime in India. I won't be going into the details of the product liability regime since I know that Darren will be dealing with it soon. But however, it must be understood that pharmaceutical fact that drugs itself are considered to be goods in India. And Specifically, the Consumer Protection Act of 2019 divides the responsibility between the manufacturer, product seller, and product service provider. And the reason why this becomes so important when we talk about the consumer and retail landscape in India, and the reason why we say that it has become a lot more robust when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, is because previously the only recourse that a consumer could have, perhaps, even though there was a recourse under the Consumer Protection Act itself, generally the consumers preferred a civil or a criminal petition because of the fact that the consumer protection regime itself was not as robust as it is today. But however, with this new regime, what we see is that product liability in pharma has increased. It has become twofold, and a lot more consumers might want to seek remedies under this particular act. So, in terms of what has been introduced, the liability, as I mentioned, has been divided between the manufacturer, seller, as well as the service provider. The manufacturer and seller's liability is something that becomes most important and most relevant in the pharma industry. And in terms of how it is enforced, like for instance, a manufacturer could be liable for something such as not having a license and not labeling the product correctly. Previously, what we used to see is that if a manufacturer does not have an appropriate license, the recourse would be to complain to the regulatory authority under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, and appropriate regulatory action would be taken. It would not be something that would directly lead to the consumers claiming damages. But however, something that is possible with this new regime is that even if the manufacturer does not have a license or fails to adhere to the labeling requirements, then a consumer can approach a consumer forum under the 3-tier system. So lastly, as to how the challenges have evolved, is that because of the fact that the entire new regime that we see has streamlined and establishes a comprehensive product liability regime, the duties of each and every stakeholder which is involved in the product delivery has been streamlined. So essentially what we see is that the responsibility of each stakeholder to the consumer has been defined, and the consumer is a lot more aware of how and when a remedy can be enforced. And something new that we also see under the new Consumer Protection Act is that previously we had a regime of manufacturer's liability. But because the responsibilities itself are streamlined through the new law, what we see is that we also have something called as a seller's liability. So essentially what this means is that if there is a defective product, it is possible that the consumer will enforce his remedy against, say, suppose the pharmacy from where he has procured the drug, and the pharmacy can then enforce it against the manufacturer from where the drug is coming. So another challenge from the industry standpoint is that the nature of product liability under the Consumer Protection Act is that of strict liability. So for the benefit of doubt, there's also certain defenses which is available under the new consumer protection regime, which is something new. We did not see this before. And these include, say, like situations where the consumer has overlooked the warnings related to indication, or the use of product has been inappropriate and not in line with the way it's supposed to be used and the way it has been labeled and indicated in the package. But however, while these defenses may dilute the liability itself, it might not absolve the liability of the particular manufacturer or the seller itself. So these are some things that have to be kept in mind now, because the product liability regime has itself become so robust that consumer and retail activities have to be undertaken with utmost caution now.
And very, very important points. So Ratnadeep, I will come to you now. You talked very lucidly about investments in pharma sectors, and we are talking about accessibility. So I just want to understand from you, is there a role, or what is the role of healthcare financing in improving the access of medical treatments? And there would be some regulations, of course, may not be specific to pharma, but general regulations that might be influencing as well as impacting. Can you just throw some light on that? You're on mute.
Sorry, doctor. So, Dr. Antani, as you said, I mean, if we are to look at access from the perspective, from the lens or prism of financing, we can look at it from two perspectives. One is obviously in terms of what is available to the consumer of the healthcare services, and of course, the financing required by the producers or the manufacturers of pharma products and services. So if I were to take the second one first, because ultimately to any sort of equation, there's a supply side and a demand side. So on the supply side, if you're looking for capital, obviously, if you're looking for domestic capital, there are fewer constraints in terms of what can be accessed, whether it is traditional financing from banks or it is equity investments from domestic capital. There are literally no real restrictions, and you can invest into pharma companies in the same manner as you would invest in any other manufacturing company. If you were to try and look for foreign capital, which is obviously something which is a major source of growing any sort of industry in a country at our stage of development, then you have various channels through which you are allowed to invest into India in the pharma sector. So historically, again, there used to be a lot of differentiation between brownfield and greenfield pharma and restrictions around that. Uh, but principally speaking, there are three routes today to invest into pharma. There is, of course, what is called foreign direct investment route, which enables entities to put in money in the equity or equity-like instruments of any company in India. There is what is called the foreign portfolio investment route, which essentially is meant for mature companies, typically ones which are publicly traded on stock exchanges, and entities which have such an FPI, or foreign portfolio investment license, are able to pick up both debt instruments as well as equity instruments as long as they are traded on the market. And the third, which I think is perhaps the most relevant one in terms of nurturing the industry, is the fact that pharma is specifically one of the sectors in which FVCI investments are allowed, or foreign venture capital investments are allowed. Uh, this particular route allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of the pricing at which investments can be made, as well as exit routes from the investment, as well as certain special taxation advantages that any FVCI investor who's registered with the securities regulator in India can avail of. So these, I would say, are the principal sort of routes through which investment can be made, and which is important again for people to understand, and especially ones who are looking for foreign capital. But having said that, as I mentioned, pharma continues to be a focus area, has always been for a significant period of time, and therefore it is broadly uh, regulation free or restriction free in terms of how you can invest capital into that sector. In terms of course, as I said, this was on the supply side, say to speak, on pharma. On the demand side, in terms of financing, I mean, going into the whole insurance angle, of course, is a completely different sort of discussion. But that is often a critical part of how the financing structure in pharma and in healthcare typically takes place. Outside of that, there are fewer opportunities, I would say, for setting up any products, for financing the end consumers of pharma and end consumers of healthcare products. But as with any other expenditure, if one were to look at financing from banks for personal loans, etc., there are no restrictions in terms of how you can utilize it for meeting any pharmaceutical needs. But insurance, as with the rest of the world, continues to be the principal financing uh, solution for, I would say, on the demand side.
I think very, very important points, and this shows that things are changing, things are evolving, and we are seeing a lot of movement in investment space, financing space. So, KG, I'll come to you now. You talked about a lot of pressure points. I know you talked about 101, you talked about need for a conducive environment. But looking at your experience in a multinational company at a very senior, heading the entire operations, at the same time your role at OTPI, apart from regulatory pressure points, there are so many pressure points I feel are there in doing the business. Uh, and so, what are they, and how industry is managing them? And do you feel that business models are changing because of that? Because not that, sometimes it becomes, when it comes to regulation, it is my way or highway type of a situation. Jo hai so hai, karo. That type of situations do happen. So do you see business models changing to be in tune with whatever regulations we have, or there is a need for change in business models, whatever you can share?
See, Dr. Antani, the business models are changing for several reasons. Now, for example, the pandemic itself has made some changes in go-to-market models, the way one can approach the customer and create value. A lot of technology interventions have come, and hence the business model has undergone some degree of the transformation. So it's not necessarily only the pressure points. Pressure points probably created by external unexpected events is something which will always transform businesses. But more than that is the if you look at the buckets, the pressure points from regulatory, pricing is a major issue and a big pressure point because this industry is dealing with an increased cost structure. The API costs have gone up dramatically. In fact, we were just having a conversation yesterday. People are talking about, 30% to 50, 60% increase in the API cost, packaging material cost, etc. You don't have the flexibility of taking price increases because even for the non-scheduled formulation, it is only a maximum
10%.
of 10%.
10%.
Yeah, so that's a huge pressure that the industry is facing, and industry has made several representation to this effect that the API cost, the KSM cost, the packaging material cost have all gone up, and it needs to get somewhere adjusted in the pricing. Otherwise, there could be a problem of availability of the product because industry cannot afford to keep on absorbing losses. It's not going to, work. So that's one of the biggest issue and challenge that is being faced by the industry right now as we speak. And a lot of discussions are ongoing with the government and Department of Pharmaceuticals and NPPA on trying to see how best we can come out of this. The second, and it's a problem which is being faced more by the oncology companies, is the trade margin rationalization, challenge, right? And there, the problem that we are facing, and some of them have, landed in courts as well, is the industry as OPPI. In fact, what we said is that we are very happy with the 30%. Okay, we are comfortable. We will give only 30% margin. But the way the net sales is calculated is very weird and it is changing every time from the definition that was there. It is including, free supplies like patient assistance program, supplies to government at a very subsidized price are being taken, lumped together and averaged. So the overall price, comes down. So our global partners say, hey, what is this? We already bring the product at a very India specific price point. On top of it, if pressures are being put like this, it becomes an unviable business in India. So that's a big, pressure. That's why I said earlier that while non-scheduled formulations are supposed to be out of price control, but a TMR type of a mechanism is trying to have a backdoor entry of price control. So
True.
that is a big pressure that is there. And from a global pharmaceutical, companies, patent infringement is the biggest, pressure point. Because within 4 years, the people go to either a Sikkim or a Buddy and get the product manufactured, put into the market, and then you are running around the courts. That completely, removes all the excitement, for bringing in new products into the country. and followed by sequential pre and post grant opposition, etc., that I talked about earlier. The other pressure point that we have is SEC meetings. Darren talked about it. The SEC meetings are not happening with the frequency at which it needs to happen. And we have, in fact, even made a representation to the DCGI saying that, the SEC committee must have the subject expert of that particular domain. If you are discussing endocrinology, you must have an endocrinologist there and not an ophthalmologist, right? So there are so many such type of things that are happening, which we hope will get streamlined, and above all, right now, in fact, Milind, is how do we ensure that the supply chain is not disrupted? Because there are still a lot of issues related to the supply chain, because API dependence is still for those who are manufacturing here on China and other sources, etc. So there is always a little bit of a worry on that particular point. How do we keep our supply chain? Right now, we feel we managed the two crises, wave 1 and wave 2, very well. We cannot let our focus off. We need to keep the focus, because any disruption in the supply chain can have a huge impact in terms of availability of the product. So it is multiple areas where the pressure points are coming in, and many of these things have in some form or the other impact on the business model, because each one is directly related to the business at the end of the day. And not just only when I'm talking about business model, it's not just confined to only a sales and marketing model. Sales and marketing model is very important, but when I'm talking about a business model, there is a manufacturing strategy, there is a supply chain and distribution strategy, there is a sales and marketing strategy. So when you're talking about a business model, we look at every one of them together. So the several pressure points that I talked about does impact the overall business model in some form or the other, in very broadly.
Yeah, I think yes. Sometimes I feel it's really worrisome, because something needs to happen. That's why I think I'm going to touch upon last on how the regulations need to revamp the primary law. But let's change now some years from now access to another important leg. Of course, pricing, KG mentioned, but promotion. I don't want to spend much time because the UCPMP code, which is voluntary and it will not become a law, which is another important point. But that is likely to become a law under Essential Commodities Act. We don't know when. For advertisements, there is another act. But in promotion, there is one very important element, especially when it comes to pharma. And KG did mention about subsidized supply to government. And that is where pharma companies do have significant interface with the public servant as defined under law, and we are talking law. So, Varsha, I want to come to you that whenever any interface with a government servant or a public servant happens, there are certain do's and don'ts. There are certain prohibitions and restrictions, purely from anti-bribery or a bribery point of view. So I just want to touch upon how the law is and what companies should be aware of, the recent changes that have happened. Let's not touch upon promotion and advertisement for the sake of time, but I want you to spend time on just the anti-bribery and interface with government officer.
Sure, Dr. Antani. So the reason why advertising or promotion to public servants becomes very essential when we talk about pharma businesses is because of the fact that that when companies want to advertise or promote their product to doctors on a government payroll, then essentially they will be promoting the product to a public servant. And the reason why this is very contentious is because of the fact that they will be triggering the Prevention of Corruption Act. So what this Prevention of Corruption Act so essentially the Prevention of Corruption Act has recently been amended, And now we see that the act of providing an undue advantage to a public servant, as well as the act of receiving such undue advantage, is punishable. So generally, when we perceive corruption in most jurisdictions, including India previously, the way the framework was that receiving an undue advantage was punishable. But however, now companies can also be liable for providing an undue advantage. And undue advantage has a very broad bearing. So sometimes when companies are promoting their product to a doctor on the government payroll, then it's possible that they might be held liable under Prevention of Corruption Act, because such promotion itself can be considered to be undue advantage. So therefore, companies must ensure that the relevant state or the central government laws which govern the employment of such doctors on the government payroll does not prohibit such engagements. So when I speak of engagements, it can be something as simple as inviting a doctor for a webinar or an event which the pharmaceutical company is conducting. So there are certain safeguards that they need to install in order to ensure that they're not triggering the provisions of Prevention of Corruption Act, and also have to ensure that the laws which govern such doctors do not prohibit the doctors from engaging with private parties. So another thing that has to be kept in mind from the perspective of Prevention of Corruption Act is that post the amendment, the recent change is that that even companies are punishable with penalty under this framework. And it's not just individuals which are engaging in such activities, but the companies can also be punishable with a fine. So therefore, it becomes very important that the pharmaceutical companies are engaging very carefully with government doctors. And in addition to this, it must be ensured that any such engagements with government doctors is also in line with the code of ethics, which has been issued, which is the NCI Code of Ethics, and it now falls under the National Medical Commission Act. Because under this particular code, doctors are not permitted to accept gifts from pharmaceutical companies, and they're also not permitted to endorse a drug. So pharma companies must ensure that that none of their advertisements or any form of marketing practices or events are not sidestepping the legal requirements which are prescribed for doctors as well, in addition to ensuring that the Prevention of Corruption Act is not being triggered.
Yeah, very important point. But another point I would like to add also is, especially the global companies, be always watchful about two important acts. One is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, and the UK Bribery Act. Because if you have some interface with US or Europe or somewhere, both these acts do get triggered, and the compliance to both these acts are required. So now, Tanya, I think Darren and KG both talked about pricing, and it's the biggest pressure point. There is a 10% control on non-scheduled. But recently, what we have seen is NLEM 2021, which is National List of Essential Medicines, which has been already there. So I just wanted to touch upon quickly how this NLEM 2021 is going to impact the industry.
Sure, Dr. Antani. And in fact, the introduction, or rather the proposition of NLEM 2021, it's a procedural matter. So the renewal of NLEM happens every 5 years. The last NLEM that we had was NLEM 2015. And since that was due to expire, there has been a proposed NLEM 2021. But what we observe from the proposed list is that it seeks to control prices of patented drugs as well. And Mr. KG had also pointed this out, that so the DPCO does not bar the imposition of price control over these patented drugs, but there has been no precedent. So when you do bring in patented drugs under price regulation, you are bringing in another block to encouraging innovation in our country. And I think that would be one of the most primary issues that do come to light under the proposed NLEM. And what has also been observed is that in the proposed NLEM 2021, it contains multiple drugs which are meant for treating the same condition. So it adds certain extra drugs or substitutes for the drugs that had already been a part of NLEM 2015. So there have been a number of FDCs which are proposed to be brought under price control, which are generally not included in this list unless they have a proven advantage over the individual ingredients that are being administered separately. So these additions that have been proposed, they do not really rationalize the objective of the DPCO itself. And there was also one point that Mr. KG pointed out with respect to the trade margin rationalization approach. So this approach was taken up by the NPPA previously, where it regulated the prices of anti-cancer drugs or certain medical devices and oxygen concentrators as well, in view of the public interest. But what we do observe is that in the proposed NLEM 21, there have been these drugs, the drugs for which there was already trade margin rationalization and a slashing of prices, these drugs have also been proposed to be included. So this would actually, in practical application, mean that there will be further slashing of prices, because they are now their prices that will be calculated, they will be on the existing average prices and not the original price that was there before the TMR was applied. So this might reflect in slashing of these prices further and may impact the manufacturers' interest in actually bringing these medical devices or drugs into our country. And the last point that I would like to highlight in terms of the proposed list is that under NLEM 2015, there was a focus on encouraging innovation because it provided certain leeway to incremental innovations like sustained release mechanisms or controlled release mechanisms. Uh, so they were included under price regulation only if they have been mentioned specifically with respect to any medicine under the NLEM. But what we observe is that under NLEM 21, these modified releases have been aggregated. So it implies that for any drug where a modified release has been mentioned under the proposed NLEM, all forms of incremental innovations would be brought within drug price control. So this again remains to be seen, because we are still awaiting the a declaration or rather notification of the new NLEM 21, and how it becomes incorporated into the DPCO, it still remains to be seen in our country, and that is how we will determine how it will impact the pharmaceutical industry and the whole pricing criteria in our country.
That is true. I think this is one of the biggest dot which needs to be connected well. And to continue from what KG mentioned about pressure points, if this is not taken care of, it's going to become another big issue for the sustaining the industry. Now, let me touch upon the last part, and I'll come to you, Darren. Varsha touched upon Consumer Protection Act, but now recent amended Consumer Protection Act has come out with a concept of product liability. So I want to talk about how the product liability under Consumer Protection Act has emerged and is going to impact. And I also want to touch upon the technology. Of course, we had a long discussion yesterday on digital health and technology, but quickly maybe how technology is the greatest enabler. But how the law is playing a role in involving technology in the pharmaceutical sector. I know there are two separate topics, but I wanted to merge both, and you can go ahead with that.
Sure. So I think one misconception, at least that we see in some general discussions, is that the consumer law doesn't apply to pharmaceutical products, and that's actually not the case. Pharmaceutical products, meaning your drugs of any nature, are definitely covered within the consumer protection framework. So when you look at liability, there are two legislations to look at. You have your legislation, which is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, which is a regulator-facing legislation from a liability perspective, because the person who can take action under that law is the regulator. When it comes to consumer protection and product liability, that's a consumer-facing law. And here is where if a consumer has an issue with your product, then they can institute a complaint before a consumer forum for appropriate action. Now,
this is the addition in the law. That's what the amended.
That's right. So this product liability that has now been put out is basically So there are the main factor is you have to prove that there has been some sort of harm or an injury, right? So it could be because of a manufacturing defect, it could be because of a deviation from the manufacturing specification, or it could be from any sort of a warranty or guarantee made with respect to a product, and that product it did not meet that particular standard, even if it's prescribed by law. And if you actually fall within any of these issues with respect to a defect, and it leads to a harm or an injury, then you are open to a possible product liability claim from the consumer standpoint. And not only are you open to a consumer product liability claim, it can be in the form of a class action. And if it is a class action, because many people have a similar issue with respect to that particular product, then in that case, even a class action suit can now be instituted before a consumer forum. But the interesting thing to note here is that it's not only the consumer who can take up a complaint before the consumer forum. There is also a new authority that has been put out under the consumer protection law, which is the CCPA, or the consumer commission, right? And this consumer commission is able to basically protect, or they are entrusted with protecting the rights of consumers, which includes the right to be protected from any hazardous products in the market. So if the CCPA is able to identify that a particular product is hazardous for the public, they are themselves able to take action against the manufacturer or the service provider or the seller, and they're able to pass certain orders. For example, they can ask you to recall the product from the market. They can ask you to reimburse the cost of that particular product to the consumers. And so they've been given these powers themselves. But in addition to that, they can institute their own complaint before a consumer forum, and the consumer forum is then empowered to issue damages to the consumer, and it can be collected from the manufacturer or the seller. So this whole framework is actually now something that is a little more easily accessible for consumers to be able to hold manufacturers responsible for these particular issues. Now moving to technology, yeah, like you mentioned, Doc, we've talked about this a lot, but in any case, I think in the pharma sector, technology plays a very important role throughout the entire chain, right? Right from the research perspective, because when we talk about how technology can help, for example, how big data can help with the research process. If today we had, a robust raw data which is digitized in India, the possibility to be able to discover new drugs quicker is actually, expedited because of the fact that you're able to test more chemical compounds using the existing data to see what kind of therapeutic efficacy you can have at the preclinical stage itself. So you're using more data in that stage itself can actually help with the drug discovery program itself. In addition to that, when it comes to supply, and this is where we are seeing the use of technology has actually been able to bridge the gap with respect to accessibility of medicines. And that's where your e-pharmacies have come in, because now with the advent of e-pharmacies, you're able to reach more of the population when compared to a time where you actually had to go to a brick and mortar store in any part of the India, and you weren't so easily accessible to a particular brick and mortar store. So with the option of having doorstep delivery, even if you are now at a more remote location, the possibility of you being able to get your supply of medication is much higher, because you just have to go place the order online, and then after that get that drug delivered to your doorstep. So I think technology has become a huge enabler for the pharma sector as well, specifically, and of course the healthcare ecosystem is developing a lot thanks to technology as well.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Darren. I think, now I have the last comment from Ratnadeep and KG. But before that, there are two short questions, Darren. I want you to address them. One is, this is from Erin Bailey. Can foreign doctors endorse pharmaceutical products in advertisements in India? without triggering the Anti-Corruption Act? Slightly tricky question, but would you want to address?
Sure, sure. So thanks, Aaron, for the question. So I think I'll break this down, right? So there are two restrictions to look at. One is when it comes to endorsements of pharmaceutical products, and the other is where you can trigger an anti-corruption situation. So first of all, under domestic law, endorsement of a pharmaceutical product by a doctor in India is prohibited, regardless of whether it trips the anti-corruption law or not. However, as you know, that does not extend to doctors who are not registered in India, and therefore, and in addition to that, we don't have extraterritorial applicability of the Indian medical law. So, if a doctor were to endorse a particular a pharmaceutical product from outside of India, and that was being displayed within the country, it would not actually trip the medical restriction under the law. And we have seen this done in very creative ways by certain companies that are there. But when it comes to triggering anti-corruption law, I think I'll differentiate. Not all marketing activities can trigger an anti-corruption law. For example, if you're advertising, it doesn't necessarily mean that because a government or public official has seen the advertisement that becomes an issue. It's more with relation to promotional activities that you have to look at, being a little careful. Again, so when it comes to promotional activities, for example, if you were to pay for accommodation for a webinar, for a seminar, or if you had to pay for flight tickets from one place to another, or if you had to pay a remuneration for having attended an event. These are, and all of these being sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, these are events which can actually trigger anti-corruption law. So the question then remains whether a foreign company outside of India is going to be held responsible for such an event. The answer is tricky because on one end, the public servant will be held responsible. On the other hand, again, there is no extraterritorial applicability of this law. But at the same time, I think you also have to remember that, I mean, it's not only our anti-corruption law that comes into play.
Exactly.
You have the FCPA, you have the UK bribery legislation, and so many more. And I see KJ is smiling, so maybe I'll hand over to him also for this.
Did you want to add something here very quickly? I think, that is where Darren rightly put it from India point of view, yes, but please be cognizant of your local anti-corruption laws because that can put you in a big trouble. So Darren, another very quick question. Of course, we had a whole entire day yesterday, but I think I have to touch upon digital health cards for individuals in the regulation and the regulation of the data involved therein. So can you touch upon maybe a minute?
Sure. So yeah, we are seeing a rollout of the whole digital health card ecosystem, and I think Doc, you also have one, ID Health ID now. To answer this from a data protection point of view, see, just because this entire scenario is taking place to the government, it does not mean that the laws that are currently applicable for data privacy do not apply. They do. So for the purposes of your collection of data, for the purposes of being able to transfer that data from either the government to a private entity or private entity to the government, these particular data privacy laws continue to hold good. So all the particular requirements in terms of obtaining your consent, in terms of having a privacy policy, all of these requirements continue to hold good, and they will apply as though, if we were dealing with a private entity itself. And that's why if you go to the website of even today, let's say Arogya Setu or any of the other, government applications, you find exactly the same kind of compliances that you would find if you were a private entity as well. You have your privacy policy, you have your terms of use. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that the transparency that you find in some of these newer age government technologies is a little more transparent. And I think the consent requirements, all of that is still being met very well.
Yeah. I think that addresses the question. So before I move on to KG to conclude, Ratnadeep, I have a very short question. I'm sure you have discussed elaborately, but I just want you to just pass on the message to the listeners that how the investment climate has been, and your advice on best practices a company can have towards investments. I know you have covered it, but would be some repetition, maybe a minute. You're muted. You're muted.
I always forget this. Sorry, doctor. So, Dr. Antani, I think, the message is clearly that there are major macro factors which are driving investment into the pharma sector in India. One is obviously diversification of supply chain. There is obviously a counter movement where people are looking to localize supply chains within specific countries to be self-sufficient. But there are obviously competitive advantages that the Indian market produces. So that's a major macro driver, I would say, for investment. ESG metrics is another major macro driver, and obviously our experience with being ready for the next pandemic or next such event as Mr. Geji outlined, which is driving a lot of attention towards that. So there is a very active environment. There is a lot of activity we're seeing in the sector, and the best thing, as I said earlier, to be ready for that is outside of your business case and the business model is obviously being front-footed on regulatory compliances, being able to demonstrate compliances not just with Indian regulations, but where FDA and other compliances or inspections are regular to try and keep that up.
Thank you so much. That was very crisp and very apt. So, KG, now is my last question to you. I know you may find this a slightly loaded question, but I want you to do the SWOT analysis of Indian pharma. And in view of that SWOT analysis, do you think that drugs and cosmetic tech needs to be revamped? KG.
See, let me put it. Yeah, it's quite a broad one. If you have to do the.
And it's a very loaded question, but I just want to quickly touch upon that.
The way that I look at it is that the biggest strength, at least of our members of OPPI, doctor, is the research and innovation, because you are able to really address the unmet medical needs. That is the biggest strength that we bring to the table. Had that not been there, our entire approach to COVID would have been very different. Today, millions and millions of lives have been saved because of its research and innovation. That's one of the biggest strengths. And the industry responded, both global and local, in an extraordinary fashion. That's the biggest strength of this, industry. There are areas, from a local perspective, if there is a lot more transparency, predictability, consistency in the policy environment, it becomes a lot more amenable for operations. So these are areas which, in terms of ease of doing business, one can always improve, these areas. And an example being, you abolish IPAB without having a parallel mechanism to address the intellectual property issues. Neither established IP codes nor done anything, and IPABs has been. So these are all some of the weaknesses which needs to be fixed. But the opportunity is great because market is a very large market. It's a young market, and more importantly, doctor, the way that I'm looking at is with the new government showing some intention towards moving towards the direction of discover in India, there is a potential opportunity to shape the policy. And this is where I'm going to link up what you asked me, whether there is a need for revamp of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. I feel yes, because before the study, the DNC, the committee was formed. In fact, we did a thorough analysis of the entire Drugs and Cosmetics Act. It is a very, very archaic act that we have. It needs to undergo entire, thing has to be looked at it right from the definition, to the various provisions that are there in the act have to be looked at very carefully. The good part is that that is also recognized by the regulator, that yes, it needs a degree of revamping, and that's what one is working on. And the threat that we are all anticipating is the new NLEM. We really do not know in what shape and form finally it's going to come.
Yes.
Everyone is keeping their fingers crossed. Hopefully, it will be, balanced one. Uh, the reason why I'm saying, Dr. Antani, is that, see, with very draconian measures, the industry must not be put into hard corner. Then there will be a big challenge for delivering all the medicines that are required. So there has to be a good balance of access, affordability, and at the same time ensuring that the industry is able to reasonably survive well. And that's the way that I look at it.
Thank you very much, KG, for spending your 2 hours with us. I think what I will conclude by just one or two lines that yes, as you very rightly mentioned, that there is a need from transitioning from making India to discovering India, and for that we need to have a very swift and easy transition through very conducive legal and regulatory environment. Because whenever we talk of Indian regulations, especially in pharma, everybody speaks something that expect unexpected, and that is why these also happened by both of us in the beginning. So I am looking that a day comes very soon, and with the present government focusing a lot on pharma sector, which was evident by Mr. Narendra Modi's address today at the Innovation Summit, that very soon the dictum people say that expect unexpected in India becomes expect expected in India. With that, I would conclude this and thank everyone for being patient for all these 3 days. Have a great time ahead, and over to Dipshi for conclusion.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our speakers and our supporting partners and our audience for being with us for the last 3 days. We hope that we will have something similar again in the future, and we hope to see you all back. Again, for the CLE credits, I have posted the details in the chat box. Please take note of the session code if you wish to apply. And with that, I conclude the session for today. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.